Chapter 16 of the A.E.F. with General Pershing and the American Forces. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Jeremiah Sutherland, Victoria, British Columbia. The A.E.F. with General Pershing and the American Forces by Heywood Broun. Chapter 16. We Visit the British Army. He was 26 and a major, but he was 3 years old in the big war, and that is the only age which counts today in the British Army. The little major was the first man I ever met who professed a genuine enthusiasm for war. It had found him a black sheep in the most remote region of a big British colony, and had tossed him into command of himself and of others. Utterly useless in the pursuit of peace, war had proved a sufficiently compelling schoolmaster to induce the study of many complicated mechanical problems, of subtler ones of psychology, not to mention 2 languages. It is true that his German was limited to "throw up your hands" and "come out or we'll bomb you," but he could carry on a friendly and fairly extensive conversation in French. The tuition fee was 2 wounds. He was a fine, fair sample of the slashing, swanking British Army which backs its boasts with battalions and makes its light words good with heavy guns. We rode together in a train for several hours on the way to the British front, and when I told him I was a newspaper man, he was eager to tell me something of what the British Army had done, was doing, and would do. "If they'd cut out wire and trenches and machine guns and general staffs," said the little major, "we'd win in 2 months." Without these concessions, he did not expect to see the end for at least a year. However, he was concerned for the most part with more concrete things than predictions, and I'd best let him wander on as he did that afternoon with no interruption save an occasional question. He was returning to the front after being wounded. There had been boating and swimming and tennis and a deuced pretty girl down there at the resort where he had been recuperating, and yet he was glad to be back. "You see," the little major explained, "I have been in all the shows from the beginning, and I'd feel pretty rotten if they were to pull off anything without me. The CO wants me back. I have a letter here from him. He tells me to take all the time I need, but to get back as soon as I can. The CO and I have been together from the beginning. It isn't that the new fellow isn't all right. Quite likely he's a better officer than I am, but the CO wants the old fellows that he's seen in other shows and knows all about. That's why I want to get back. I want to see what the new fellow's doing with my men." He limped a little still, and I pressed him to tell me about his wound. It seemed he got it in the April show. "There was a bit of luck about that," he said. "I happened to take my Webley with me when we went over, as well as my cane. They've got a silly rule that officers mustn't carry canes in an attack, and that they must wear Tommy's tunics so the Fritzies can't spot them. They say we lose too many officers because they expose themselves. Nobody pays much attention to that rule. You won't find many officers in Tommy's tunics, but you will find them out in front with their canes. And there's sense to it. I've always said that I wouldn't ask my men to go any place I wasn't willing to go and to go first. Come on, that's what we say in the British Army. The Germans drive their men from behind. Some of their officers are very brave, you know, but that's the system. I remember in one show we were stuck at the 3rd line of barbed wire. The guns hadn't touched it, but that wasn't their fault. There was a German officer there, and he stood up on the parapet and directed the machine gun fire. He'd point every place we were a little thick, and then they'd let us have it. I got a machine gunner on him. Just peppered him. He was a mighty brave officer." I reminded the little major that I wanted to hear about his wound. We were coming through a German trench that had been pretty well cleaned out, but close up against the back there was a soldier hiding. When I came by he cut at me with his bayonet. He only got me in the fleshy part of my leg, and I turned and let him have it with my Webley. Blew the top of his head right off. Silly ass, wasn't he? Must have known he'd be killed. I asked him if his wound hurt, and he said no, and that he was able to walk back and felt quite chipper until the last mile. "The first thing a wounded man wants to do," he explained, "is to get away. If he's been hit, he gets a sudden crazy fear that he's going to get it again. Most wounds don't hurt much, and as soon as a man's out of fire and puts a cigarette in his mouth, he cheers up. He's at his best if it's a blighty hit." Here I was forced to interrupt for information. "A blighty hit, don't you know what that is? It's from the song they sing now, 'Carry Me Back to Blighty.' Blighty's England. I think it's a Hindustani word that means home, but I won't be sure about that. Anyhow, a blighty hit's not bad enough to keep you in France, but bad enough to send you to England. Those are the slow injuries that aren't so very dangerous. Next to getting to blighty, a fellow wants a cigarette. I never saw a man hit so bad he couldn't smoke. I saw a British plane coming down one day and the tail of it was red. The Germans fix up their machines like that, but I knew this wasn't paint on a British plane. He made a tip-top landing, and when he got out we saw part of his shoulder was shot away, and he had a hole in the top of his head. That was a close call, he said, and he took out a cigarette, lighted it, and took 2 puffs. Then he keeled over. The little major and I got out to stretch our legs at a station platform, and I noticed that salutes were punctiliously given and returned. I suppose, I said, quoting a bit of misinformation somebody had supplied, that out at the front all this saluting is cut out. No, sir, said the little major sternly. Somebody told that to the last batch of recruits that was sent over, but we taught 'em better soon. They don't get the lay of it quite. It isn't me they salute, it's the king's uniform. Of course, I don't expect a man to salute if I pass him in a trench, but if he's smoking a cigarette, I expect him to throw it away, and I expect him to straighten up. You've got to let up on some things, of course. There's shaving now. I expect my men to shave every day when they're not in the line, but you can't expect that in the trenches. Naturally, I shave myself every day anyhow, but I'm lenient with the men. I don't insist on their shaving more than every other day. When I got to the chateau, where the visiting correspondents stay, I found the officers at mess. There were 4 British officers, a Romanian general, a member of Parliament, a Dutch painter, and an American newspaper man. As at Verdun, the conversation had swung around to literature. It all began because somebody said something about Shaw having put up at the chateau when he visited the front. Awful ass, said an English officer who had met the playwright out there. He was no end of nuisance for us. Why, when he got out here, we found he was a vegetarian, and we had to chase around and have omelets fixed up for him every day. I censored his stuff, said another. I didn't think much of it, but I made almost no changes. Some of it was a little subtle, but I let it get by. I heard him out here, said a third officer, and he talked no end of rot. He said the Germans had made a botch of destroying towns. He said he could have done more damage to Arras with a hammer than the Germans did with their shells. Of course, he couldn't begin to do it with a hammer, and anyway, he wouldn't be let. I suppose he never thought of that. Then he said that the Germans were doing us a great favor by their air raids. He said they were smashing up things that were ugly and unsanitary. That's silly. We could pull them down ourselves, you know, and anyhow, in the last raid, they hit the post office. The old boy's got nerve, though, interrupted another officer. I was out at the front with him near Arras, and there was some pretty lively shelling going on around us. I told him to put on his tin hat, but he wouldn't do it. I said, those German shell splinters may get you, and he laughed and said if the Germans did anything to him, they'd be mighty ungrateful after all he'd done for them. He don't know the Boche. He told me, added a British journalist, when I want to know about war, I talk to soldiers. I asked him, do you mean officers or Tommies? He said that he meant Tommies. Now you know how much reliance you can put in what a Tommy says. He'll either say what he thinks you want him to say or what he thinks you don't want him to say. I told Shaw that, but he paid no attention. Here the first officer chimed in again. Well, I stick to what I've said right along. I don't see where Shaw's funny. I think he's silly. The major, who sat at the head of the table, deftly turned the conversation away from literary controversy. What did you think of Conan Doyle? He said. Bright and early next morning we started out to follow in the footsteps of Shaw. We went through country which had been shocked and shaken by both sides in their battles and then dynamited in addition by the retreating Germans. I stood in Peronne, which the Germans had dynamited with the greatest care. They left the town for dead, but against the shattered wall was a sign which read, Regimental cinema tonight at the Splinters, Charlie Chaplin in Shanghai. This was first aid. A frozen man is rubbed with snow, and a town which has suffered German frightfulness is regaled with Charlie Chaplin. Life will come back to that town in time and to others. After all, life is a rubber band, and it will be just as it was only an instant after they let go. We turned down the road to Arras and drove between fields which had been burned to cinders and trodden into mud by men and guns only a few weeks ago. We turned down the road to Arras and drove between fields which had been burned to cinders and trodden into mud by men and guns only a few weeks ago. Now the poppies were sweeping all before them. Into the trenches they went and over. First line, second line, third line, each fell in turn to the redcoats. They were so thick that the earth seemed to bleed for its wounds. Presently we were in Arras, and our officer led us into the cathedral. We won't stay in here long, said the officer. The Germans drop a shell in here every now and then, and the next one may bring the rest of the walls down. People keep away from here. This indeed seemed a very citadel of destruction and loneliness, but as we turned to go, we heard a mournful noise from an inner room. We investigated and found a Tommy practicing on the cornet. He was playing a piece entitled Progressive Exercises for the Cornet, No. 1. He stood up and saluted. "Have the Germans bombarded the town at all today?" the captain asked. "Yes, sir," said the Tommy. "They bombarded the square out in front here this morning." "Did they get anybody?" "No, sir, only a Frenchman, sir," replied the Tommy with stiff formality. "Was there any other activity?" "Yes, sir, there were some aeroplanes over about an hour ago, and they dropped some bombs in there," said the Tommy, indicating a street just back of the cathedral. "And what were we doing?" persisted the captain. "We were trying out some new anti-aircraft ammunition," explained the Tommy patiently. "But I don't think it was any good, sir, because most of it came down and buried itself over there," and he indicated a spot some 15 or 20 feet from his music room. The captain could think of no more inquiries just then, and the soldier quickly folded up his cornet and his music, and after saluting with decent haste, left the cathedral. For the sake of his music he was willing to endure shells and bombs and shrapnel fragments, but questions put him off his stride entirely. He fled perhaps to some shell hole for solitude. From the cathedral we went to the town hall. Here again one could not but be impressed with the futility of destruction. The Germans have torn the building cruelly with their shells and their dynamite, but beauty is tough. Dynamite a bake shop and you have only a mess. Shell a tailor's and rubbish is left. But it is different when you begin to turn your guns against cathedrals and town halls. If a structure is built beautifully, it will break beautifully. The dynamite has cut fine lines in the jagged ruins of the town hall. The Germans have smashed everything but the soul of the building. They didn't get that. It was not for want of trying, but dynamite has its limitations. We got up to the lines the next day and had a fine view of the opposing trench systems for 10 or 12 miles. Our box seat was on top of a hill just back of Messines Ridge. We saw a duel between two aeroplanes, the explosion of a munitions dump, and no end of big gun firing, but the officer who conducted us said that it was a dull morning. Our day on the hill was a clear one after 3 days of low clouds, and all the flyers were out in force. Almost 24 British planes were to be seen from the hilltop, as well as several captive balloons. Although the English planes flew well over the German lines, they drew no fire, but presently the sky began to grow woolly. Little round white patches appeared, one against the other, cutting the sky into great flannel figures. Then we saw above it all a plane so high as to be hardly visible. Indeed, we should not have seen it but for the telltale shrapnel. These were our guns, and this was no friend. Now it was almost over our heads. It seemed intent upon attacking one of the British captive balloons, which could only stand and wait. The guns were snarling now. We were close enough to hear the anger in every shot. The shrapnel broke behind, below, above, and in front of the aeroplane, but on it sailed, untouched, like a glass ball in a Buffalo Bill shooting trick. Yet here was no poor marksmanship, for at 10,000 feet the air pilot has 40 seconds to dodge each shell. He merely has to watch the flash of the gun and then dive or rise or slide to right or left. Sometimes, indeed, the shrapnel lays a finger on him, but he whirls away out of its grip like a quarterback in a broken field. The guns stopped firing, although the German was still above the British lines. Somebody was up to tackle him at closer range. Where our plane came from we did not know. The sky was filled all morning with English flyers, but each appeared to have definite work in hand, and not one paid the slightest attention to the German intruder. This was a special assignment. When we caught sight of the English flyer, he had maneuvered into a position behind his German adversary. We caught the flashes from the machine guns, but we could hear no sound of the fight above us. The planes darted forward and back. They were clever little bantams, these, and neither was able to put in a finishing blow. Our stolid guiding officer was up on his toes now, and rooting as if it were some sporting event in progress. Looking upward at his comrade, 10,000 feet aloft, he cried, "Let him have it!" The hostile attitude of the spectators or something else discouraged the German, and he turned and made for his own lines. The Englishman pursued him for a time and then gave up the chase. The consensus of opinion was that the Briton had won the decision on points. "They've been making a dead set for our balloons all week," said an English soldier after the German plane had been driven away. "If they get the balloon, does that mean that they get the observer?" I asked in my ignorance. "Lord bless you, no," said the soldier. "No danger for him, sir. He just jumps out with a parachute." Next we turned our attention to the big gun firing. We could see the flash of the guns of both sides and hear the whistle of the shells. After the flash one might mark the result if he had a sharp eye. There was no trouble in following the progress of one particular British shell. For an instant after the flash, a high column of smoke arose above a town which the Germans held. A minute or so later we had our own column, for a German shell hit one of the many munition dumps scattered about behind the British front. Our own hill was pocked with shell holes, and the tower near which we stood was nibbled nigh to bits, and we had a wakeful, stimulating feeling that almost any minute something might drop on or near us. The Tommy with whom we shared the view undeceived us. "This hill," he said. "Why, there was a time when it was as much as your life was worth to stand up here, and now the place is nothing but a bloomin' Cook's Tour resort." Our last day with the army was spent at the University of Death and Destruction, where the men from England take their final courses in warfare. We began with a class which was having a lesson in defense against bombs. A tin can exploded at the feet of a Scotchman and peppered his bare legs. 500 soldiers roared with laughter, for the man in the kilt had flunked his recitation in trench raiding. Officially the Scot was dead, for the tin can represented a German bomb. They were cramming for war in the big training camp, and they played roughly. The imitation bombs carried a charge of powder generous enough to ensure wholesome respect. The Scot, indeed, had to retire to have a dressing made. The trench in which the class was hard at work was perfect in almost every detail, save that it lacked a back wall. This was removed for the sake of the audience. An instructor stood outside, and every now and again he would toss a bomb at his pupils. He played no favorites. The good and the bad scholar each had his chance. In order to pass the course, the soldier had to show that he knew what to do to meet the bomb attack. He might take shelter in the traverse, he might kick the bomb far away, or with a master's degree in view, he might pick up the imitation bomb and hurl it far away before it could explode. Speed and steady nerves were required for this trick. An explosion might easily blow off a finger or two, yet after all it was practice. Later there might be other bombs designed for bigger game than fingers. We followed the students from bombs to bayonets. The men with the cold steel were charging into dummies marked with circles to represent spots where hits were likely to be vital. It looked for all the world like football practice, and the men went after the dummies as the tacklers used to do at Soldiers' Field of an afternoon, when the coach had pinned blue sweaters and white Ys on the straw men. There was the same severely serious spirit. In a larger field, a big class was having instruction in attack. Before them were 3 lines of trenches protected by barbed wire ankle high. At a signal, they left their trench and darted forward to the next one. Here they paused for a moment and then set sail for the second trench. At another signal, they were out of that and into a third trench. From here, they blazed away at some targets on the hill representing Germans and consolidated their positions. Instructors followed the charge along the road which bordered the instruction field. They mingled praise and blame, but ever they shouted for speed. "Make this go now," would be the cry, and to a luckless wight who had been upset by barbed wire and sent sprawling, "What do you mean by lying there anyhow?" It was a New Zealand company which I saw, and in the class were a number of Maoris. These were fine husky men of the type seen in the Hawaiian Islands. All played the game hard, but none seemed so imaginatively stirred by it as the Maoris. They were fairly carried away by the enthusiasm of a charge, and left their trenches each time shouting at top voice. The capture of the third trench by no means satisfied them. They wanted to go on and on. If the officer had not called a halt, there's no telling but that they might have invaded the next field and bayoneted the bombardiers. Over the hill there was a rattle of machine guns, and beyond that a more scattering volume of musketry. We stopped and watched the men at their rifle practice. "You wouldn't believe it," said the instructor, "but we've got to keep hammering it home to men that rifles are meant to shoot with. For a time you heard nothing but bayonets. A gun might have been nothing more than a pike. Later everything was bombs, and sometimes soldiers just stood and waited till the Boches got close so that they could peg something at 'em. But when these men go away, they're going to know that the bombs and the bayonet are the frill. It's the shooting that counts." We saw a good deal of the British Army during our trip, but the thing which gave me the clearest insight into the fundamental fighting, sporting spirit of the Army was a story which an officer told me of an incident which occurred in the sector where he was stationed. An enlisted man and an officer were trapped during a daylight patrol when a mist lifted and they had to take shelter in a shell hole. They lay there for some hours, and then the soldier endeavored to make a break back for his own trenches. No sooner had his head and shoulders appeared above the shell hole than a German machine gun pattered away at him. He was hit, and the officer started to climb up to his assistance. "No, don't come," said the soldier. "They got me, sir." He put his hand up and indicated a wound on the left-hand side of his chest. "It was a damn good shot," he said. End of chapter 16.